Welcome to the Ethics Experts, where we're elevating ethics and compliance and HR to the strategic level it's supposed to be.
Joe Murphy, the one and only.
How are you, Nick?
Good, man. Back for round 3 here.
Yeah. I noticed your little device twirling around there in the foreground.
Yeah, this is my reminder of the chaos of life, You just never know what's coming. This is like my picture of risk, you know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm. Oh, I just look out the window.
Even better. So you're on for part 3 of our series, and we're talking about this phenomenal article you wrote, Protecting the Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer. And I just want to kind of dive right in. You've been in this field for, decades. What does this slow squeeze look like? Give us some like real world sense of, what retaliation against a chief compliance officer can look like. Not just like on the termination side, but sort of some of those more subtle forms you talk about.
Right. And there are many ways that can happen, and they can frustrate the compliance officer, where the compliance officer needs to raise issues. It can be something as simple as personnel needs or wanting to go to a conference, to the real test of strength when a senior leader wants to do something and doesn't want to hear from the pesky compliance people. And the compliance person is saying, this is not something that we should do, or this is something that raises legal or ethical questions. And the senior people don't want to hear about it. And, Nick, there's a tendency in our field sometimes to look at the workers, the day-to-day people, as if they were the problem, and to focus on training the workers. But when you look at the big cases, you read the Wall Street Journal, it's the top people. It's
right.
The top people directly involved in the crime, or the top people signaling that they don't want to hear any excuses, they want results. Part of the compliance officer's job is to be the one who says, no, we shouldn't do it this way, we can't do it this way. And then to escalate up to the board. Well, nobody in management wants to hear that. And then if you're reporting to the general counsel is likely to say, oh, all right, I'll take it from here. You don't need to go to the board, I'm the one. Or
right.
No, there's legal risk if we do what you want to do, so we're not going to do it.
Yeah, and they have a different lens, or they have a different agenda, or a different list of priorities that sometimes are not
right.
in line with what the sort of source or the source of the advice, of where that advice is coming from,
And I recall being at the SCCE Academy in Dubai and actually having a compliance officer tell us that her office was in the basement of the building, literally in a converted closet. If that
right.
doesn't signal to the employees that you can brush off the compliance officer, I don't know what would. So the obvious retaliation is termination, but you can get exactly the same result by little pieces of not inviting the person to important meetings, and cutting their force, cutting their resources, limiting their access, all those types of things that makes the job impossible. So there are many ways to retaliate in organizations.
Yeah, just kind of building a moat around somebody or throwing them down in a basement ostensibly is creating the same distance that, actual overt retaliation, creates.
Right, exactly. And we could do a whole separate discussion about retaliation and the need to recognize it, acknowledge it. I'll just put one point that when people do risk assessment, they need to include retaliation as one of the risks, because I think we all tend to underestimate the danger and prevalence of retaliation. But you certainly
that is so spot on. That ECI report comes out every year to, the state of the global the culture survey that they do. Mm-hmm. And year after year, you see the same trend that somewhere between, it's like 50, approximately 50% of people, I think it's a little higher in the last one, who speak up face actual retribution. Okay. So no room full of compliance people would say that even 10% retaliation is acceptable. They all say, hey, we have a no tolerance policy for retaliation. And I think it's a huge blind spot. I think underestimating the prevalence of, or at least underestimating the perception of the prevalence of, which are actually the same thing from a human, from an individual's perspective, is a huge blind spot. And it should be in the risk assessments for sure. And it should be part of your, case by case workflow to make sure that you're bringing up the elephant in the room, which is the fear of retaliation, and building in like processes to follow up with those folks 30 days after, 60 days after, to check in and say, have you been retaliated against? Like, how are you going to demonstrate to the organization that like you actually have a commitment against retaliation if you're not on a person, like if I can't sort of have a restaurant that says, oh, we have we're a 4-star restaurant, we have the best dining experience, unless each person feels like they had a great dining experience. You know what I mean?
Right. We could talk for a long time about this area of retaliation. And one fellow I know, Keith Reed, has made the point that you can do data analysis to detect the prevalence of retaliation that you wouldn't see otherwise if you're just conducting investigations.
How does he do that?
We published a piece about that in our newsletter, Compliance and Ethics Ideas and Answers.
Oh, I must have missed that one. What was his big takeaway?
It's that it's more prevalent than you think.
Yeah, right.
If you look at the data, and he's very good on how you determine the data. When you look at the data analysis, you find that, let's say, here's the rate of promotions for people who don't speak up, and here's the rate of promotions for people who do speak up. That speaks volumes. But one of the difficulties in this area is, if you talk, let's say, with a corporate investigator, they'll say, oh, well, there's not that much retaliation. They're looking at a legal standard of retaliation. In the real world, the impact of retaliation can be the very subtle things that signal to people, keep your mouth shut.
100%. And it also, and there's this knock-on effect from it, kind of to your point. It sends this message to other people. So the retaliation risk is not just on the individual basis, it's on like the bystander. On you know what I'm saying? Like, there's so much risk intelligence in the organization. There's so many things that people see, not just in terms of things going, people doing things wrong, but things that could be improved, that we very easily can sort of, send the message that it's like, keep your freaking mouth shut, keep your head down, and just do your job. Not let's improve the company. Let's pursue this mission sort of in earnest, And
I would add one thing. When we talk about reporting systems, I like to use the term speak up systems, but the saying should always be speak up, listen up.
Yeah, right.
Because management, it's more important to get the message to management than it is to employees. If management listens, the people will talk. You don't have to have
100%.
slogans. You don't have to have campaigns. If management listens and acts and treats people reasonably and asks people, the employees will speak up. And one of the keys to this is to have an empowered compliance officer. And if the compliance officer can easily be knocked down and not protected, you damage the ability to encourage people to speak up. And that's part of the reason for focusing on how do you protect a compliance officer. Because I'll tell you, if I had a friend or relative working in a company where they didn't have an empowered compliance officer, and the person came to me and said, gee, should I report what I saw that this officer was doing in the company? I would have to explain to them all the risks, all the downsides, all the bad things that can happen to you.
Yeah, it's not a simple yes.
I'm a big believer in speaking up. And so that's part of the reason for the article on ways to protect the compliance officers. And one of the things that we as a profession need to get over is being afraid of appearing to just feather our own nest. Like we're just trying to protect ourselves and that's why we're doing this. When the reality is, if you don't have the strength of your position, if you don't have the protection, you can't protect the company. And also to that point, you can't protect the potential victims of the company's misconduct. And that's a big factor to me. Part of our job is to protect the workers, protect the investors, protect the customers, protect the public, protect people who could be hurt by the company. And therefore, we need the strength and positioning that we can do that. And that's kind of the rationale for focusing on the protection of the compliance officer.
So that's kind of a good segue to my next question, or the next thing I wanted to talk about, which is like, how do you think the chief ethics and compliance officer is sort of structurally more vulnerable than other, officers, other C-suite officers? Like, what makes the role, uniquely exposed as compared to like the CFO or the general counsel or the chief operating officer?
The purpose of the compliance officer. A compliance professional has a responsibility to the public that is serious. It's not just rhetoric. We're there to protect people. Other people may have that as part of their job. Like I'm a retired lawyer, but I was a lawyer. And yeah, I knew there was a public interest and I knew you didn't lie to the courts. But we're also really charged with the responsibility of defend the company. No matter what they did, defend the company.
Yeah, that's like higher on your prioritization list or something.
Right. For the compliance officer, we always need to think about who are the victims if these things happen.
Right.
And how do we protect the public? And yes, we protect the company, but we protect the public. And we need to be especially alert to the impact of groupthink. People in organizations have a tendency to go along with the organizations. Groups of people make decisions very different from individuals. And so we always need to be able to step outside of that and say, oh, wait a minute, what's the worst that could happen if we do this? And what would be the impact? We need to think about the potential victims of misconduct. And that marks us as different. And even like for me, I can compare my role as a lawyer to my role as a compliance person, and they are different.
It's a different, I don't know, it's kind of like a different aim or a different, direction, or you like score points in a different way, not in the political sense, but just in terms of like denoting success in the role.
Right, exactly. Now, for a lawyer, your success would be, well, we won the case, yay. For a compliance person, it's nobody got indicted, nobody got killed, nobody got hurt. That sounds real exciting.
Yeah, and it's harder to quantify. It's less romantic.
Right.
So I want to go kind of deep on some of these mechanisms. You first sort of talked about employment contracts for a first line of defense. But first of all, in practice, what proportion of compliance officers actually have them? Like, do you feel like the norm has shifted, or do you think this is still sort of like an exception for compliance officers at sort of, at scale having these sort of employment contracts?
I don't think it's very common, but I will say that the easiest place to start is any company that's just gone through the grinder, that's just gone through the mill. If, for example, if you reached out to Siemens before the big bribery scandal, they probably would have brushed you off. After the big bribery scandal, they would have done anything they could do to redeem themselves. So if we're looking at where it's most likely to be effective, it's the companies who have gotten in trouble and now they're trying to show their virtue. So that would be a starting place. They're looking for cover. But we can also get to some of the other points that I cover, which we need the Department of Justice, for example, just one example, when looking at cases and looking at companies, to make the point that the empowerment and protection of the compliance officer is a key factor in determining
That's a great point.
How good a company is. By the way, while the department sometimes talk about this stuff, you simply don't hear cases where the department looked at a company's prior existing compliance program and said it was good, bad, or indifferent. And that's a big hole that we've had now for a long time. But if they were to signal this point, if they were to take a case and say, one of the reasons we gave this compliance program credit was because the compliance officer had an employment contract, the company required that any negative action against the compliance officer must have the prior approval of the board. If the government said, we're giving this company credit, one of the main reasons is because they did this, I can guarantee you the lawyers, who are often the obstacles to empowering compliance officers, would suddenly take notice.
Yeah. What is the guidance? It says, is it properly funded? Does it work in practice? This is it's hard for it to work in practice, to your point, at least to some degree, when the wings are clipped or we're setting the compliance officer up sort of for failure should something go wrong, because to your point, it's a different type of sort of executive role than CFO or general counsel or something, right? Exactly. And they don't have those. It's almost building, an incentive, to your point, to not speak up or to not do the right thing or to just kind of fall into the groupthink, which is kind of the antithesis of what we should be presenting, right? Ideally, it's an idea of meritocracy. Ideally, all the trade-offs are sort of on the table when a big decision is happening. And, there's clarity, at least from a fact set, perspective around like what, course of action you're going to take. If the chief compliance officer is sort of sitting in the corner, or even worse, down in the basement in a converted closet, and they kind of need to stay there because they don't have those protections, it's just kind of, the whole system is sort of set up for failure. Those points of guidance can kind of turn into platitudes.
Right. And, one of my favorite references was from you saying that the compliance officer should have a place at the table, but not the kiddie table.
Right.
It's got to be the big adult table. It's got to be the same table as the CEO, the general counsel, the chief financial officer, the top people. The compliance officer needs to be there and needs to have direct, unscreened, uncontrolled access to an independent board committee.
Right.
Now, I'll throw out another kind of type of protection. I'm almost looking at this from an opposite perspective, and that's the extreme importance of networking. Because I can give all this great advice, well, have the company do this, have the company do that, and the answer might be, Joe, if I could get all that, I wouldn't need it. I'd already be in a good position. They're not going to listen to me. Well, the one thing that you as a compliance officer have much more control over is networking and being in contact with others in the field. Because number one, it's a very important sanity check. When everybody in your company is telling you you're doing the wrong thing, it's nice to talk with your peer at another company who can say to you, no, Joe, I got the same thing. We all hear that same thing. You just got to go past it. And if you start feeling threatened, like, they're going to fire me or downgrade me, your network is extremely important in terms of your possibility of landing on your feet. And it's nice if your company will pay for you to go to the top conferences like SCCE and Compliance Week. There are other types of networks. Many cities now, maybe most, have local compliance forums where you can talk with people. And today, it might be difficult to get to a live conference, but you might be able to do it by video. You may even decide that it's worth your own resources to do that. But I would say the networking is very important, both for your emotional health and for your financial future in terms of finding alternatives.
That was a big point on why we started this biweekly webinar series. Biweekly in the sense that's twice a week of the ethics verse. We're getting like 1,000 people plus per week to show up to this to these webinars, and like there's so many people that I've heard directly like, oh man, I've made so many friends from this thing. Like the chat is super active, and to your point, like you have to build that network. If you don't have the budget to go to an in-person conference, obviously face-to-face is great, but you have to do something, plug into your local, compliance forum, go to these different, webinars, go to the groups that exist on LinkedIn. There's a lot of people out there. And kind of to your point from before, there's so many people out there that are like-minded, that are trying to put this, that are sort of subject to the same sort of unique prioritization list that you as a compliance officer in your company are subject to. And this, what's best for the world, what's best for, the public good has a higher sort of ranking on our individual lists. To your point, connecting with more of those people, you learn so much, and,
right.
You kind of can take some of your career risk kind of into your hands, because how many people, the most successful people that I know, they always get their job from a referral. It's not from filling out something on Indeed. You know what I mean?
Yeah, you know people. And I'm a big believer that some people find excuses and some people find a way. Mm-hmm. You want to be in the category where you're always going to find a way. If there isn't a group in your vicinity, create one.
Yeah.
Make one yourself.
Right.
Find a way to do this. So of course you have to have some initiative in this. But it is critical, I think, just for kind of your own grounding, as well as the potential networking and other career prospects.
So you make this point that I thought was pretty cool, kind of provocative, of the mandatory SEC 8K filing. Talk to me about this let's talk about this idea, and let's talk a little bit about sort of how the idea has been pushed back on, or like what some of the counter arguments are. So what's the nature of it, and like what's the sort of shape of the debate around this provocative idea?
I'm not sure how much it's actually been proposed, nor how much has been pushed on agencies. And, different agencies during different administrations have different political orientation. So you might have an agency today that's not as responsive. Down the road, you might have one that is. The idea of the 8K, and that concept, even if it's not officially an 8K, but the concept that if you do something negative to the compliance officer, you must report it, kind of causes management to think, well, we better have a serious reason. It better not just be because we're irritated because the compliance officer, she's actually doing her job. And if you require something like an 8K filing, which is a notification when you have a material or extraordinary activity
event,
that affects the value of your company, you also need to be aware of the enormous creativity of my colleagues who do corporate work, who would say, okay, if we've got to file an 8K because we have a compliance officer, let's just not have a compliance officer.
Yeah, right.
Or we'll have a compliance officer and she'll have a nice office in the basement closet.
Yeah,
where
so a wood paneled basement. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. So any regulation would have to cover those types of possibilities. Another piece, because I have heard people talk about the 8Ks, but you don't want to forget the stock exchange listing requirements, where you can also do the same thing. And I've thrown out some other ideas in the article. One of them is that when your internal auditor issues its opinion letter, it must issue an opinion on the empowerment and independence of the compliance officer.
Yeah, that should be part of their kind of audit, Yeah.
That would get people's attention because that's scary. The outside auditors get their noses under the tent, and they can find out what's going on, and the internal auditors in turn would be reporting to the outside auditors.
Yeah, the outside auditors would at least kind of take into consideration those kind of internal audit reports.
Right.
You know what I mean?
And then another thing, this is my wish list, like for things I'd like to see happen. One I would really like to see happen is a revision to the lawyer's ethical standards. So it's clear that part of the lawyer's obligation is to take steps to prevent misconduct, including supporting and assisting the compliance officer and the compliance group. More often than not, in my direct experience and in things I've heard from people, unfortunately, the lawyers and general counsel are just as likely to be obstacles. And the general counsel is just as likely to be saying, oh, I'll take that report to the board. Here, let me go through and fix it. And so in the part that says nobody's following what you asked them to do, we're just going to say that managers have been very cooperative with you. And so that's something that's important to change. So the general counsel cannot be working with the board, with the senior management on how to get rid of the compliance officer. The general counsel should be there saying, no, I agree with the compliance officer. They really need to be empowered. And I think a change in the ethical standards, none of this is magic. Each of these steps is incremental, but to change what the standard is for lawyers' ethics, so it's clear they have an obligation to help prevent misconduct, and it's clear they have an obligation to help to support the compliance officer do their job. And lawyers will say, oh, no, we're already responsible for public interest. No.
Yeah, I got that covered.
Yeah, no, it's not good enough what's there. And there is kind of a little inside secret here. If you read the literature, like the legal literature, you'll see lots of legal professors talking about what's wrong with compliance and why did compliance fail. They tend to just sweep under the carpet the point that the compliance officer is almost never the most powerful person in the company. The general counsel is almost always more powerful than the compliance officer. The general counsel is far more likely to know what's going on than the compliance officer. But the lawyers are sitting back saying, look, the compliance officer failed.
Yeah, and it's also like
reporting to you.
Yeah, exactly. In most cases, that's the case.
Yeah, I think really too many of them.
Right.
That have to report that way.
So let's go back to this idea you had about like board approval before any adverse action to the chief ethics and compliance officer. Like, where do you think the sticking point is on that being sort of the norm? Like, do you think, boards would be willing to adopt it? And let's just kind of talk about that. Like, that seems kind of obvious to me in some ways. There's obviously sort of a filter potential. Like, if you think of, if you kind of game theory it out, like there's a filter potential, or call it a spin potential, to the extent that those folks are not in the room. I personally, to answer the question I just asked you, I don't think most boards would be against it. Like, I think a board has a fiduciary duty to its investors. That sort of seems like, to the extent that the compliance officer is sort of meant to, help the company do the right thing and find risks, across, the business. I can't imagine that most boards would be like, absolutely not. Do whatever you want with them. Take that dog out back and shoot it. But it's not the norm, kind of to your point, which is why it's sort of a novel idea. Let's kind of pick that apart on like what those stoppers are, the impediments for this to becoming the norm.
Starting point would be, you don't have a specific, we want the board to enact this. You have a board resolution enacting and empowering the compliance program. And it's in that context where you provide what the compliance officer is to do. You provide the compliance officer is going to have unlimited access to all the data in the company, for example, which is a complaint you hear from compliance people.
Totally.
If they're supposed to do program evaluation and access to data, the data people won't give them the access, or the marketing people won't let them in their system, or the HR people say, oh no, we got privacy issues. When the board says, I don't want to hear it, do it, they do it. So you put that in the board resolution. The resolution is where you put that the compliance officer must report to the audit committee or some other independent committee. It must not be filtered, and that this is a requirement. One other piece I would put in this that most people wouldn't think of is to adopt the SCCE code of professional conduct, which is a standard that, for example, requires the compliance officer to be diligent, to report to the board, all those types of things, and make it mandatory.
Right.
Because that also provides an element of empowerment. And it's easy to do in terms of, you would say to them, look, here's the standard. And generally the board's not going to examine it like in great detail. They're going to say, oh, professional code, yeah, that's a good idea. Let's put that in there. I would add to that recommendation that they revise the code of conduct for the company so that employees who are subject to professional ethics codes are expected to follow them and may not be retaliated against for following their professional ethics codes. So I do it in that context. But I would see the board resolution as a threshold item. And I will say, when I was in-house, this is exactly what we did. We had a board resolution. And the board.
And who pushed that? Who prompted? What was the catalyst for that resolution? Was that at the CU? Okay. So how did you do it? My man, you're just moving mountains. I love it.
Yeah. Well, partly because it's not the most important thing on their agenda. Just from a political point of view, this is not something that they're intensely worried about.
Yeah, they're not even thinking about it.
A lot of other things they're worried about. Here's something from the compliance people that they think is going to help us if we have to deal with the government. And yeah, it's probably something we should do. Let's look at it. What do you mean by this? You get like a question or two. They're not likely to nitpick the thing. You have probably more trouble getting past the general counsel than you will with the board.
That's the hump to get over, I'd imagine.
Yeah, but in the resolution, whatever documentation you have has to make the point. The connection between the compliance officer and the board is direct, unlimited.
Right.
And I remember Pat Nasso, who was a compliance officer and a government monitor, telling about how he was in a company and he had the audit committee chairman agree to meet him for lunch in the company cafeteria. And when they had lunch, the head of the audit committee said, well, what did you want to discuss? And Pat said, I just wanted everybody to see me. I mean, this is not exactly what he said, but he wanted everybody to get the message of the connection with the audit committee. And knowing Pat, of course, he had things to discuss, but it was that symbolism, sending that message.
Right.
That's also part of how you protect the compliance officer. by having that relationship with the board and the chair of the audit committee. So that's another piece of it.
So what advice would you give somebody who, they want to have that kind of a relationship with the board, but maybe they're only getting 10, 15, 20 minutes per quarter to get in front of them? What advice would you give them to kind of maybe start laying some of the groundwork or some of the stepping stones to get the type of resolution that you were able to get past? Like, is it a question of how you show up strategically? Is it sort of back channeling? Maybe that's a wrong word. Take the negative connotation away from it, but sort of, connecting with them outside of those meetings. Is it just sort of assuming the relationship? I should have the relationship, so I'm just going to start kind of reaching out to these people. Like, how would you sort of advise somebody to start strengthening those kind of connections to this,
first,
critical group?
Point for me, I see too often when people talk about the board or the management, and I just tell them, stop thinking in the collective. Think in the individuals, just like a salesperson. Let's say you have 6 people in the audit committee. I guarantee you, one of the 6 is going to be more favorable to compliance programs, and one of the 6 is going to be more negative. You start with the one who's more positive. You look for the opportunity to have that individual contact with them. And, you have to be careful with the politics. But I think there's great value in establishing a personal connection with these people, with the people on the audit committee. And I'm a big believer that one of the most important skills is the ability to listen, which is a terribly difficult thing to do. But if you have interaction with the board, listen to what the individual members are saying so you pick up what their concerns are and what their interests are. And so you can follow up more on an individual level. Now, people are going to be saying, well, that's great for you, Joe. You might know the people in the audit committee. They're so far above me, I have no idea who they are or what they do. And that's clearly a sign that you're not well positioned in the company if you don't know the members of the audit committee. But I would say when you get your chance to talk with them, draw them out. Instead of just talking to them, listen to them. You could ask them, each of you, what is your experience with compliance programs? What do you think is wrong? What do you think in our company we need to avoid? They're not going to be expecting you to ask for their opinion.
Totally. Their opinion is, yeah.
And most people love to talk about their opinions. And so there's that just kind of element, the interpersonal relationship, when you get that access. And by the way, that point applies across the board, all different levels of management. Don't assume where people are coming from. Listen to them. Draw it out. People are much more willing to listen to you once they feel you've listened to them.
Yeah. What do you think that is? Why do we struggle with that as a profession? Is it the sort of like the overhang of the stereotypes that we kind of inadvertently assume we have that creates like an insecurity in having those kinds of conversations? Is it a wiring of the average compliance person from a personality perspective? Because everything you're saying to me is like that, some of those things would be on like my first 100 days in a new role to make sure I have those connections and I understand the lay of the land and I'm positioning myself to have the influence I know I'm going to need to have down the road. Is it the reactionary nature of the role that like we quote unquote don't have time for these kind of important non-urgent types of things? Like, what do you think we can root out here?
No, I think it's something called human nature. We generally all like to talk more than we do listen. I will mention, I was at a program the other day at Rutgers Law School in Camden, and we had Wei Chen there as a speaker. And she made a comment that startled me when she said, we don't listen enough, we need to listen more. Because I thought that was so spot on. It isn't something you hear too much. And we tend to think we've got to get the compliance message out there. We've got to tell people, we've got to talk to people. It's a tougher road, but a more effective road if you listen to people first. If you go out in the field and listen to people. Even before the board, if you listen to people and draw out what their concern is. And if somebody is really negative about the compliance program, you want to try and get them, get one-on-one and say, what do you see as the problem? What do you see, what's your experience has been? And sure enough, they'll have a story about maybe some training that just put everybody to sleep and they hated it. And my answer to someone would be, I feel exactly the same way. I hate that kind of stuff.
Right.
I hope we never do anything like that. I think it's an enormous way. Well, once you've made it clear that you're on their side and you understand them, you open the door now for communication and cooperation.
Yeah. And I read this, I don't know, it was like it was an article, I think on Twitter or something a couple weeks ago. And it was just talking about how there was a study that showed that the strongest relationships are like strengthened by like the mutual hate of something. So if you hate that kind of training and the person, and you've kind of created the circumstances to hear that, that other leader or that board member or whoever who has had a bad experience with compliance share their hate of this kind of thing, that's a great opportunity to strengthen that relationship. There's science behind what I'm talking about here,
And if you can do this, like I've talked about some of the formal protections, employment contract, board, all this kind of stuff is great. But if people know that you have a personal relationship with the audit committee members and they're on your side, that's scarier than all the contract pieces.
Yeah, that's a lot stronger sort of seatbelt or
Yeah.
That's a wider moat,
I will comment on one type of protection I've seen, which on the surface sounds good, but when you think about it, it's not as positive. It's the idea of what you would call a golden parachute.
Yeah, okay.
Right, that, if the compliance officer goes, you give them a whole bunch of money, and that'll sure deter the company. No, it won't. Not a penny of that money comes out of any officer's pocket.
Right.
And what it does, if you have like this golden parachute where they have to give you a lot of money if you go, it converts a moral issue into a commercial one. You want to get rid of the compliance officer? Okay, just write a check.
Yeah, what does it cost?
Good. Yeah. And anyway, it's not they never say this, but it's not my money, it's the share owner's money. And it's only a one-time expense. Nobody will notice. We'll get her out of here and get somebody who will be more compliant. And how do you like to be the junior staff members knowing that the compliance officer has this big financial ticket and you don't?
Yeah, right. Yeah, what message does that send? I mean, that's just more of a separation within a group that needs to be highly cohesive,
Yeah, it is an element of security for the compliance officer because he almost might be thinking, boy, I sure hope they fire me. I could use all that money. But I don't think most of us are like that. So it's nice to have some element of security. But I think it's not the best system for protecting compliance officers.
So just to kind of break that down, there are certain cases, or at least in theory, a compliance officer is able to negotiate for an employment agreement. Part of that employment agreement is some kind of a golden parachute that sends sort of a false sense of security to that chief compliance officer saying, okay, well, they're going to have to pay me a bunch of money. They ain't going to spend that. This is like some more protection for me. And you're just kind of saying it's kind of an illusion of security because of the sort of perverse incentives it creates, first of all. And second of all, it's probably a drop in the bucket. It might be a lot of money to that individual, but it's probably a drop in the bucket at any organization of any, an organization that would be willing to do that has got to be of some kind of a certain size,
And understand, I'm not saying it's a bad thing. And if they want to put that in your contract to say no, I'm saying it's not a silver bullet. It is not the solution. It can be a tool. As a compliance officer, if I knew that if I stood my ground and they fired me, I would have enough money to live for a while, I would definitely feel more secure. But to say that, this is the answer, you just put this large amount of money at stake and the company will be afraid to fire you, that's not reality. They'll fire you just like that. And then they'll take the share owner's money and pay you, and you'll be gone. So it will not prevent the company from doing this. It will give you some additional security. So people should look at that with their eyes open and say, no, this isn't the cure. But as part of my employment contract, there should be a severance provision. If you violate the contract, you will owe me X.
Yeah.
So I see that, but I don't see it as a complete solution.
But do you think that there's any kind of like financial, protection that doesn't have this commodification type impact? Like, I think it kind of can turn that person into a commodity, and it can kind of move away from sort of the essence or the spirit of what the role should provide, and be like, all right, well, this is just kind of a dollars and cents decision. Do you think there's any of those kind of protections? And again, I know you're not advocating to say, well, don't argue for a severance package. Don't argue for the false, or perhaps overstated protection that might come from, an employment agreement or whatever. But I'm just kind of intrigued and interested in this sort of paradoxical sort of incentive that it might create in an organization.
The fact that you also have a provision that says they must get the audit committee's prior approval you have to have things like that in there. So it
Yeah.
can't be
Okay.
just the management saying, "Oh yeah, you think I'm breaking the law? Well, guess what? You're out of here. Here's your money. Leave." You can't
Right.
do it. You got to go. Oh, you think I'm breaking the law? Okay, go report it to the audit committee and give them all the. No, they don't. They don't want to say that. So you have to have those other protections, and I would say prior board approval is critical. Not endorsement after you fired the person, approval before, with the compliance officer having the absolute right to appear in person before the audit committee, which should also be in the contract. And these are things, for the details of this, these are all things that I tried to spell out in the article that we had in the newsletter.
I'm not trying to be cynical. It sort of grates against my my nature, but like, how do we affect real change kind of across our industry on this protection topic? It's either going to kind of happen one of two ways, like kind of bottom up, each individual compliance officer arguing for, pushing for a board resolution that gives them that sort of direct access to the board and those kind of protections and all those kinds of things, right? Like creating their own, being the sort of, architect of their own sort of world, right? A bunch of these sort of little shots being fired sort of from the ground level, or it's going to come from a top down perspective. It's going to come from governing regulatory bodies sort of demanding it and mandating, just like they did with Sarbanes-Oxley, that CFOs would need to sign off on the financials as individuals, create, that's kind of a public interest type of a protection that ties accountability down to an individual, kind of doing this sort of reverse of that on a top down perspective and saying like, okay, this is what is sort of mandated across all public companies. Like it would probably start, there, right? Like how do we do that? Because I mean, how do we actually make that happen? Because everything you're saying makes a lot of sense. It at least creates kind of, it creates sort of sustainable circumstances or a sustainable environment whereby a compliance officer has like protections built in to the role that don't really exist sort of writ large right now.
Start with knowledge that compliance officers should be thinking and know about these options. They needn't be absolute. They needn't say, I need to get every one of these. By nature, I'm an incrementalist. I'm not if I can't have everything, I don't want anything. I'd love to see every single protection I've suggested come into effect. I'm a realist. That's not going to happen. So let's see what we can get. And I've kind of pointed to the vulnerability. The starting point is going to be the companies that get in big trouble and they're running for cover. And they will do something dramatic so that they look good and they get out of monitorship and they're not in trouble. Now,
you can play off their sort of self-interest.
Right. Now, with the current Department of Justice, I don't think we're seeing as much enforcement, but we're just one of a lot of countries and a lot of jurisdictions that have enforcement capabilities. And so one of the factors you always have to consider is the regulators and enforcement people. And I know there are people in our field who say, oh, no, don't forget that, just be ethical. But the reality is we are affected by enforcement and by regulation. And to the extent that enforcers and regulators are starting to make this point, that also resonates with people. So there's kind of the first point is awareness. Have the list. See what you can get. Some of these things, your employer will not see it as that big a deal. They will say, yeah, sure, yeah. Oh, a board resolution? Yeah, sure. Yeah, give us a draft and we can work with that. Because they're not really focused on it. They're not thinking the same way you are. And so you look for what you can get. And the right of access to the board, prior approval, prior notice to the board, they might be willing to do that. They may not necessarily be thinking in the same lane that you are. You may be thinking it's a big deal. They may be thinking, no.
Sure. This is no brainer. This is no big deal.
You're not asking for as much money as they thought. Yeah, you want this contract stuff? Yeah, sure, we can handle that. They will not have the same. It's what you might call an asymmetrical interest. Your interest is here, theirs is low. They don't care. So they may go along with it because they're not focused on it the way you are. So you kind of think of it in kind of a tactical term. What are they going to give on? What I'm telling people is do not just walk in without thinking about this. Think about these things. Think about what kind of protections you can get. Negotiate the best you can. Get as much as you can get. And look at the circumstances. At the same time, we should be on the political side, we should be on the governmental side, saying to our friends in the regulatory and enforcement environment, look, the big weakness in our field is this vulnerability, the absence of access, the absence of empowerment. And here's what you can do to help us with this. We need actual cases that show that it matters to you guys on the enforcement side.
Right.
And so you get those different things working together. I'm a big believer in the public policy side. Not many people in my field are, but I am. And
Why is that, you think?
I've had the personal experience of working with that. I've worked with the OECD working group on bribery when they came up with a set of standards. I work with them, and we can all do that side of it, so getting the government to do their part.
Yeah, it seems like a big opportunity, actually. I don't know. I mean, that doesn't seem like that tough of a sell to put this in a couple of your things.
Yeah.
It's a sentence, man. I mean, that's all we're asking for, right? A sentence in the next 5, things that come out would do wonders.
Yeah, exactly. And particularly if you can put these different things together, and like the personnel skill of learning how to listen. I will admit, I'm a much bigger believer in it than I am a practitioner of it. I like to talk. I wish that I listened more, but I'm a big believer in the power of just active listening and drawing out what people's resistance are and what their concerns are, and making it clear that you understand and identify, and where you agree. I think we all agree boring training is terrible. And so if that's what bugs somebody in the audit committee, you let them know you're 100% on their side. You couldn't agree more.
Yeah, find that common ground.
Exactly.
You have the most influence on people who think that you're like me and you like me, Yeah,
I think that's right. And you listen to me. You take my opinion seriously.
Right. Well, man, another awesome episode. I'm a little sad that this is the end of the trilogy. I don't know what you call what a 4-parter is, but you always have a standing invite to come back, because every time we come on, we go so deep on something that I think is really, plaguing our industry, or you just have like a really unique perspective. And it's not just sort of academic and sort of ethereal. You kind of bring it down, to earth with, techniques and, actions that people can take. I mean, the thing that really resonated with me is like, this is really a game of incrementalism. It's a game of inches, like football, and you got to just get whatever you can, whenever you can get it. And that takes sort of a concerted effort. That takes sort of a forward pressure toward, the ideal state, the vision that you have for your program or for, your career. It takes sort of intentionality, but there are inches to gain. There are, that art of incrementalism needs to be engaged, I think, kind of across our industry. And I think we're really going to see the curve bend, over this next chapter that we're in,
If we push it, it's on us to push it. But there's a wonderful saying that the perfect shouldn't be the enemy of the good.
Right.
So you're not going to get a perfect arrangement, but don't accept a terrible one. Do what you can.
Yeah. And, how you get what you want? You ask. You know how you get what you want out of life? You ask. And, my parents always said, if you don't ask, you don't get. And I think that that's so true. I try to tell that to my own kids. Like, you have to ask. And so when you're going for your raise, ask for a bigger number, and also ask for the board resolution. Put a bunch of stuff in there. Put some things in there that they're going to say no to, so that they have, they feel inclined to say yes to something else. If you're just going in with just a number, you're leaving an opportunity on the table, I think, to kind of get some of that incrementalism that you're talking about. Exactly right.
The way I've heard the saying is, if you don't ask, the answer is always no.
Exactly. It's like, it's all no until you ask.
Yeah, exactly. And if you ask, the worst that can happen is they'll say no, which if you didn't ask, that's what you'd have.
It's already a no. Yeah, exactly. Well, man, standing offer, of course, to come back anytime. I just love having you on the show. You're such a pillar of our entire community. The impact that you have kind of continues to be so powerful across all of our lives and all of our mindsets. So appreciate you being so generous with your time and your knowledge.
Okay. Thank you, Nick. I clearly enjoy the opportunity. This is a great program, and certainly people benefit from listening to your programs. I think there's great value in that.
Cool. Thank you so much. All right. We'll see you next time.
All right. Bye.